So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for another Second Saturday Civil War lecture with the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall. As always, our lectures are made possible with the generous support of the Massey Charitable Trust. So we thank them for their support. I do have several important announcements to share with you before we get started. So please bear with me for just a few minutes. And if you like, please let us know where you're watching from. We've had a great international audience over the past several months, and we always like to see how far our reach is and see where everyone's from. So please share if you feel like that. The SB Post remains open for tours each and every Saturday between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. So I encourage all of you who, if you haven't been to the SB Post, or if you haven't been lately, please stop by for a tour with one of our knowledgeable docents. Earlier in the week, the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall released a video celebrating our 120th anniversary. The video includes information on our Completing the Carnegie campaign. So I would encourage all of you to visit our website at www.carnegiecarnegie.org to watch the video and read about our plans for completing nearly 2 decades of restoration and rejuvenation work at the Library and Music Hall. Next month, we will resume meeting in person for our second Saturday Civil War lecture series at the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall in Carnegie. We will be there Saturday, June 12th at 1 p.m. This event will take place in the Music Hall rather than the Lincoln Gallery like those of us who attended in person were used to. The Music Hall will allow us to better socially distance, and I think it'll be a real nice event. So you can either enter through the library or through the Music Hall entrance on the right side of the building. We'll have, I'll be there directing people where to go. But we'll have several things going on that day, and I wanted to kind of outline what events we'll have and what there'll be to see and do. So on June 12th, the SB Post will be open for tours from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., as well as the Lincoln Gallery. So I would encourage you to stop by for a tour either before or after the lecture. Outside the building, members of the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves will be utilizing Library Park to conduct some drills for their upcoming reenacting season. So certainly, feel free to bring a picnic lunch, assuming the weather, we hope the weather is going to be nice. But you could have a picnic lunch outside and watch their drills and maneuvers, and you'd be welcome to ask the reenactors any questions that you might have. At 12:30, local musician Ron Messing, who you can actually see in the 120th anniversary video on our website, will be performing Civil War era music in the Music Hall. So I'd certainly encourage you to be in the Music Hall, be in your seat by 12:30 to catch his performance. He's wonderfully talented. And then at 1 p.m., right after Ron is finished, we will have our lecture with Zach Kausert, who is a doctoral candidate at West Virginia University. Zach is going to speak with us about the West Virginia State Guard in the Civil War from 1863 to 1865, which is an area of study for Zach. So the West Virginia State Guard were approximately, I believe it's 44 companies of home guard or militia that were raised in the later years of the war to protect those areas of the state that lacked any kind of regular military presence. So he'll use one company of the West Virginia State Guard as a case study for how these men protected their homes and communities from insurgents and from guerrillas, and how the companies in turn engaged in state building on behalf of the new state of West Virginia. So for those attending in person, masking and social distancing is still in effect at Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall, so please keep that in mind. For those not attending in person, we are going to continue streaming via Zoom and Facebook Live. This will be our first time trying this from an in-person event, so bear with us if we have a few kinks to work out. You're welcome to shoot me a message or an email if you're having any difficulty seeing or hearing anything, and we'll try to correct all of that. But you've all been such a fantastic audience over the past year as we had to pivot online that we wanted to continue bringing you this new fresh content. So June will be our last lecture before our summer break. As in years past, we will take off the months of July and August and then reconvene at the library in Music Hall for our September event, which will take place on Saturday, September 11th. So now on to today's speaker. We are joined today by Michael Wunsch. Born in Brooklyn, New York, Michael has been a resident of Philadelphia since 1966. He graduated from Salle College in 1980 and is employed by a social services company in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania. He's been speaking on Civil War topics since 2002 and is a member of the Delaware Valley Civil War Roundtable, the GAR Museum and Library, and the Lincoln Forum. He currently serves as corresponding secretary for the General Meade Society of Philadelphia. And Michael's here today to talk with us about the April 15th, 1861 mob scene at the Palmetto Flag. So feel free to ask any questions, either in the chat feature here on Zoom or on Facebook. I'll be following along with any questions that we have. And then once Michael's talk is over, you're welcome to unmute yourself and you can feel free to ask Michael a question directly. So Michael, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, John Eric. Appreciate it. Thanks to the Carnegie Library for hosting me today. And greetings from the General Meade Society of Philadelphia and from the GAR Museum and Library in the Frankfurt section of Philadelphia. So greetings from those. I'm going to speak today on the mob scene at the Palmetto Flag and other incidents at the beginning of the Civil War, following the firing and the surrender of Fort Sumter. And so thanks again for having me, and let's move forward. And I'll say that when the news of the firing upon Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861 reached Philadelphia by telegraph on the same day, it did not become generally known until published in the newspapers the next day. President Abraham Lincoln himself in Washington received no information on Charleston except through the press. And the press was releases and so forth, the telegrams, were in control of the Confederate, pro-Confederate folks in South Carolina. So the information coming out was very muted. He meets with his cabinet on this day in a short session, and also with the Virginia commissioners appointed by the state on April 8th. On Saturday, April 13, a feverish interest in the dispatches from the seat of the hostilities followed the announcement in the morning papers that the war actually commenced. Lincoln and his cabinet met Saturday night in a long session. General Winfield Scott, Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania, and Alexander K. McClure, a prominent Pennsylvania Republican, attended a conference at the White House relative to the defense of Washington. President Lincoln remarked that if he were General Beauregard, he would take Washington. President Lincoln, only the day before, had confided to Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts that Fort Sumter in South Carolina will not be surrendered. In Philadelphia, the initial outrage to the attack and surrender manifested itself in violence against Southern sympathizers in the city, a bastion of Breckinridge conservatives. After the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, a matter of fact, Breckinridge opposed allocating resources for Lincoln to fight the Confederacy. Fearing arrest after Kentucky sided with the Union, he fled to the Confederacy, joined the Army, and he was subsequently expelled from the Senate. The Philadelphia Evening Bulletin printed in bold letters, "The Southern Rebellion, that in Charleston hostilities have for the present ceased, and victory belongs to South Carolina." The Philadelphia Inquirer, in an opinion article, stated, "The calamity which has befallen the nation by the loss of Fort Sumter, which is less important as a military defeat than in the shock which it gives to the national pride. It is the logical result of Buchanan's pitiable policy in not reinforcing the fortifications in Charleston Harbor when it was entirely possible to do so. The streets in the center of the city were overrun by excitement until a late hour at night, and anyone who hinted any sympathy with the secessionists was made to take an unequivocal stand. At an early hour on Sunday that day, Major Robert Anderson evacuated Fort Sumter. In Philadelphia, as in other cities in the Union, groups of men gathered around the newspaper and telegraph offices and eagerly discussed the news of the surrender, as published in the extras. The feeling in opposition to secession was very strong, and the demand for national flags was great. From private houses, business offices, hotels, factories, and government buildings, the national colors were seen waving as a sign of loyalty. Indeed, not to have the national colors displayed invited a possible attack from the crowds who still roam the street, now in search of premises that lacked the appropriate patriotic symbols. On April 15th, 1861 in Washington, the cabinet met at 10 in the morning and stayed in session virtually all day. At the executive mansion, President Abraham Lincoln paced the second floor office above the East Room, visibly concerned about the security and the safety of the city. Secretaries John Nicolay and John Hay found Lincoln in a state of, quote, nervous tension. With his government barely a functioning entity, with appointments still to be made and policy formulated, Abraham Lincoln was called upon to shoulder the wartime burdens, literally since the first day of his administration on March 4, and that would weigh him down until the day of his death. At the news of Fort Sumter, Mary Lincoln, too, became as concerned as the rest of Washington that the federal enclave would be invaded by Confederate troops. As Southern loyalists began to depart the city, the remaining population, including the Lincolns, waited anxiously for further military protection. Washington, as was every city in the Union, was shuddered with half war excitement and half panic. The Philadelphia Inquirer printed that, quote, the plans for the seizure of Washington by the secessionists have been received by the administration through the agency of adroit detectives and a Colonel Smith, who is in command of this military district. He has taken every precaution to guard against a proposed coup d'etat. Late that night, it was told that President Lincoln reached for his telescope, climbed out on the roof of the Executive Mansion building, and scanned the Potomac, looking for any boats conveying Union troops. He turned his lens towards Alexandria, where in the midst of cheap church steeples and chimneys, he can see Confederate flags flying in the breeze. After receiving official notice of the surrender of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln and his cabinet again meet. The chief executive calls for 75,000 volunteers from the states and also for a session of Congress to meet on July 4th. Major Anderson and his men leave Fort Sumter and proceed northward by sea after a ceremony of surrender. On this occasion, an accidental blast kills 2 and injures 4 Union soldiers as a stockpile of ammunition is inadvertently detonated. President Lincoln, on the 15th of April, issues a public proclamation calling for 75,000 militia to steal the insurrection in South Carolina, eliciting an instant supportive response from the northern states. Border states such as Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, North Carolina, and Virginia are areas of discontent and uncertainty. Kentucky and North Carolina ultimately refused to respond to Lincoln's appeal, while the New York legislature commits $3 million in aid for the Northern cause. The president's proclamation reads, whereas the laws of the United States have been for some time past and are now opposed and obstructed, and the executive there of the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, by combination too powerful to be suppressed by ordinary course of judicial proceedings or by the powers invested in the marshals by law. Now, therefore, as Abraham Lincoln, as President of the United States, in virtue of my power invested by the Constitution and laws that have thought it fit to call forth and hereby do call forth the militia of the several states of the Union in the aggregate number of 75,000 in order to suppress the said combinations and to cause the laws to be duly executed. The details for this object will be immediately communicated to the state's authorities through the War Department. I appeal to all loyal citizens to favor, facilitate, and this effort to maintain the honor, integrity, and the existence of the national union, and the perpetuity of popular government, and to redress the wrongs already long enough endured. I deem it proper to say that first service assigned to the forces here called forth will probably be to repossess the forts, places, and property which have been seized from the Union. And in every event, the utmost care will be observed consistently with the object of aforesaid to avoid any devastation and destruction or interference with property or any disturbance of peaceful citizens in any part of the country. And I hereby command the persons composing the combinations to disperse and retire peaceably to their respective abodes within 20 days of this state. Claiming that the present condition of public affairs presents an extraordinary occasion, I do hereby, in the virtue of my power by the Constitution, convene both houses of senators and representatives to be summoned to assemble at their respective chambers at 12 noon, Thursday, the 4th of July next, and then to consider and determine such measures as their wisdom, the public safety, and the interests may seem to demand. Signed, President Abraham Lincoln and William H. Stewart, Secretary of State. Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania expressed exactly the same patriotic sentiments, and from Harrisburg called on the militia of the Keystone State to be readied for the defense of their own. In Philadelphia, Sidney George Fisher, gentleman, socialite, and diarist, penned about the unfolding events. No doubt Fort Sumter is taken, and its surrender has aroused the war passions of the North to a fever pitch. From all quarters come accounts that the people are arming, and the danger is now that they will go too far. The South has sowed the wind and is likely to reap the whirlwind. The president has issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 troops. He could get 10 times as many. It is hoped that this demonstration of force will keep the border states quiet, and especially Virginia, in which case the Cotton states cannot maintain their present position. Fisher further wrote that I went down to town at 12 today, found the city in a dangerous excitement. Several well-known persons who had openly expressed secession opinions had been assaulted in the streets. At the office of an obscure newspaper at the corner of 4th and Chestnut, the editor had been foolish enough to hang out a Palmetto flag. Prominent individuals known to sympathize with the South are threatened. I have a picture of the upside down of the Palmetto flag. Can be seen on many emblems in the South Carolina flags and so forth. So it's very very visible symbol of the South. A side note, the General Assembly of South Carolina had recently adopted this version as the state flag on January 26, 1861. This version of the flag added a palmetto tree to the original design by Colonel William Moultrie in 1775 for use by the South Carolina troops during the Revolutionary War. Colonel Moultrie chose a blue color which matched the color of their uniforms, and a crescent which reproduced the silver emblem worn on the front of their caps. On this morning, on the 15th, war fever in Philadelphia raged, enhanced by a large and angry crowd that increased the tumult and excitement exceeding that of Saturday and Sunday, printed the Philadelphia Inquirer. The reference of a large and angry crowd is noted in the History of Philadelphia, a book published in 1884, and it was kind of a unusual description, as most descriptions were generally not referred to in that language, but much milder. The Press, a local Union newspaper, printed, "The excitement which has marked the populace of Philadelphia since the reception of intelligence from Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor has known no parallel in the annals of the city since the fateful times in 1844, which were the scene of the nativist riots in the city in May and July of that year. Goaded on to frenzy by insults, contumelies, and injuries which have been heaped upon the national government, violent passions seem to sway every person, even those who ordinarily were undisturbed by the currents of public affairs. The agitation here doubtless increased by the presence of a few parties in allegiance with the Confederate traitors, whose language and divulged acts had been calculated to stir up the mobs. At 11 o'clock on the morning of April 15th, a report extensively circulated that the Palmetto colors had been thrown to the breeze from the office of a secession advocates recently started here under the banner of the Palmetto Flag. The newspaper, which printed 3 weeklies from March 30th to April 13th and had printed articles and commentary favorable to the Confederate cause, they advocated secessionist principles, upheld pro-slavery policies, and was critical of the Lincoln administration. Now, the Palmetto Flag, of which I have copies of their three issues, is held by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I was down there a few years ago to look at them. They're so brittle and so forth that I couldn't either look at them or make copies. But the Historical Society print them on a file, and for a small fee, I was sent the file. So that was it's a very rare newspaper to come across. No sooner had the rumors started that hundreds, and according to some reports, thousands of persons wended through their way to 337 Chestnut Street, to the building where the flag was printed. And in short time, that street between 3rd and 4th was crowded with an excited populace, patriots, loyal to the Constitution and the Union, as they were called in the local press. The reports as to the origin of the excitement vary. One is that a Palmetto flag was actually thrown out from the window. Another, that the mere fact of an incendiary and treasonable sheet being published in the city's midst was sufficient to cause to have the forms destroyed. So a little background on the paper and the office. The office was on the 3rd story of a building on the 3rd side of Chestnut. The Palmetto Flag was published by a William Kendrick and Company and a business concern known as Town and Company. Its offices were located in the same building as Dean and Company, who occupied the 1st floor of the building as a dollar jewelry store. The Palmetto Flag was published as an advertising dodge, quote, as referred to in many newspapers and books. It was said innocently by some, it was printed by which they might direct attention to their enterprise of the dollar stores. The buildings were owned by a Merrick Dean, and the editor of this so-called advertising dodge was a Henry J. Brent. To clear the printing of these newspapers up, that Merrick Dean was a resident of Philadelphia, lived on Girard Avenue. He operated the Take Your Choice for a Dollar goods jewelry store, selling to his pro-union customers, and published a paper called The Stars and Stripes to advertise. A second paper, which was printed and sold among people, quote, who don't care for the union, was called All Over the World. And to advertise Take Your Choice for a Dollar among people who hated the union, the paper of choice was the Palmetto Flag. The flag of its three papers of the Palmetto Flag earned the greatest degree of notoriety in the city. It was advertised in the pro-union Public Ledger and established daily in the city. And as the flag was known to a good many people, considerable indignation and ill will existed against it, though it was noted that the game was not worth the powder to bring it down. At the scene of the mob, the crowd, amidst the cries of "tear it down, tear it out, and let's tear out the secessionist hounds," were heard from the outside of the building. Part of the crowd washed up a narrow staircase inside the building, and regardless of a desperate-looking individual who stood at the head of the stairs with a revolver in his hand, they poured into the publication office. Before, however, they had accomplished this, more than to throw out the newspapers, the several copies out the window, the police made an appearance and the crowd withdrew to the street. The mob, managing to throw out of the window several copies of the paper, soon after found the obnoxious printing press, and that too was cast into the streets. At this time, a stalwart squad of reserve city police made a great appearance, and here only the arrival of the police and Philadelphia Mayor Alexander Henry prevented the place from being stormed and the editors from being attacked. Police Chief Samuel Ruggles on the scene also entered the building with a posse of officers and his lieutenants, and the rooms were finally cleared out. Mayor Henry then gained admittance to the building, during which the mob remained in a fury and stormy guise. Mayor Henry, inside the office, overlooking the excited crowds and the impassable squares of streets, the scene was to last about an hour. In the meantime, the crowd, which has increased, insisted that an American flag should be suspended from one of the windows of the Palmetto Flag office. The mayor sought to satisfy the mob and appeared at the front window of the third floor, and amid the multitude waved a small American flag. Not pleased, the mob demanded that a larger and one of greater distinction be displayed. The large colors were found and rolled down the front of the building and across the street. Cheers roared forth for the mayor, the flag, and for Major Robert Anderson. The cries for the form and the issue and for the editor of the Palmetto Flag, Mr. Brent, from the ever-increasing mob became more deafening. Mayor Henry, with the small flag still in hand, addressed the gathering. The speech of Mayor Henry was printed in the Philadelphia Inquirer on the 16th. Lend me your ears, as becoming good and loyal citizens, men loyal to your country and her honor. My fellow citizens, no traitor shall rear his head or have a foothold in the city of Philadelphia. This among cheers. With the help of Almighty God, treason shall not raise its destructive hand to tear down the flag of the Union. I call upon you and in the future to protect this flag at the point of bayonet and at the end at the cost of your lives. Mayor Henry waved the American flag among the deafening yells and said, "Fellow citizens, while I conjure to stand by the flag of the Union, conjure you to stand by it, do not forget the private rights of individuals. Be calm and resolute. Defend your flag against treason, but act with prudence and do not invade the rights of property or individuals." Here Mayor Henry ended. The near riot widened, swelling to many more hundreds from 3rd Street to 6th on Chestnut, and it was filled with, quote, young men and boys and minors, young people, all pro-union, anti-secessionist patriots, and working men standing for the national honor and the flag. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and advertiser printed that a dangerous mob spirit appears to have arisen from the affair. Let it be said, though, no violence was done anywhere by the patriotic-minded as the crowds cheered the flags and then moved on, finally satisfied with the displays. Now, I might add that the incident at the flag office not only was printed in the Pittsburgh papers, but due to the Telegraph and I guess the early AP wires, this story gained national attention, and Mayor Henry's they always said that it was only through Mayor Henry's efforts that the mob scene was not more destructive and more of a hazard, as it was really newspapers in every state in the Union carried something on this incident. The Daily Evening Bulletin gave an assessment of the scene. It printed, "For some time past, a paper called the Palmetto Flag has been published in this city. It was a mere advertising dodge, got up by a concern who adopted that name to attract attention to their establishment. At ordinary times, the Palmetto Flag and its treasonable sentiments would have attracted no attention, as it was of no possible account, either politically or for its literary character." Back to the scene, on Chestnut, a second speech was given by Mayor Henry, printed in the Public Ledger and other newspapers, and also referred to in a book by Matthew Goldman, Mastering Wartime in Philadelphia. When the noise subsided, Mayor Henry continued, "Your devotion to the flag of your country satisfies me that you are equally devoted to the maintenance of the laws and the preservation of order. I see that there are no traitors among you, and I rejoice to know that treason cannot rear its head in this city. This flag is an emblem of the government, and I hope that all citizens who feel loyal to it will show their respect for it and the laws and retire to their respective homes," kind of mimicking the sentiments of President Lincoln in his proclamation. 3 more cheers were given for the mayor and 3 more for the flag. However, the crowd did not seem to retire, and the popular mayor again tried to calm the excited crowd and appealed to them deftly as good citizens to leave the place. Mayor Henry, about this incident at the scene, the Philadelphia, upon Alexander Henry's death on December 6, 1883, printed, "The comparative quietude of Philadelphia during the war was largely due to Mayor Henry's coolness and good judgment. The Palmetto Flag, a paper published from an office on Chestnut Street, came out in defense of the act of the rebels on Fort Sumter. The next day, a mob visited and proceeded to empty the furniture out of the windows. The trembling printers who had taken refuge on the roof were in danger of being hurled to the street when Mayor Henry appeared on the scene. The crowd paused to hear him, and in a brief address, eloquent and manly, he so shamed the mob that they quietly dispersed. With the aid of Police Chief Ruggles, he pacified a number of turbulent assemblages. The morning the Mayor Henry was induced into the office, upon his first election, he called for the reserve police and assured them that the city would have need of them, and then established the Reserve Corps, the most effective arm of the Philadelphia force, which has always been recruited from the largest, strongest, most intelligent, and most experienced of police. It was noted that the Philadelphia had very little violence during the Civil War. Didn't have any draft riots or draft problems, and was very calm, and due mostly to Mayor Henry's work. In Philadelphia, the mayor really, one of his major jobs in his position was to oversee the police department, and Mayor Henry expanded that role. Referring again, the newspapers published a letter from Town and Company, written by either Mr. Kendrick or Mr. Dean. It read, "In consequence of the present excitement and not wanting to add to it, we have suspended publication of the Palmetto Flag for the present. We have always endeavored to be liberal in our views, but as there are symbols of a riot and bloodshed, we as good citizens sacrifice our pecuniary interests for the benefit of the city. Respectfully, Town and Company." The mob, satisfied, proprietor Merrick Dean displayed the government flags as the mob insisted and threw the objectionable papers from the windows. The same was true for the Stars and Stripes, one of the other papers printed in the office. The acts working to restore the crowd, if not for the moment, and as described in quote, good humor. The mob, satisfied, moved down to the Argus office off Dock Street, now known as Market Street, ordering that the Union flag should be displayed there. The Argus was another newspaper published in the city with pro-Southern proclivities. After visiting that newspaper, the mob marched in a body up to Market Street bearing the flag. At all points on the route, well-known Union men were obliged to make all haste to beg, borrow, or steal something red, white, and blue, and to protect their property. Searches were made from the publications room of the Southern Monitor, also a newspaper with Southern proclivities. But as the paper had suspended operations, the mob was unable to carry out their intentions of destroying the Forum. They satisfied themselves with breaking into these places and breaking up their signs. The ringleaders of the mob were here furnished with ropes with which to hang the editor if caught. Simultaneously, General Robert Patterson's mansion on the corner of 13th and Locust, which is now the location of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, was mobbed and threatened with destruction. A servant answered their call and unfortunately slammed the door in their faces. The crowd became uproarious and violent, bearing the color of the regiment. Major Robert Anderson's house was mobbed by several thousand people strong and its windows smashed. The North American and United States Gazette published the details. The ferment among the multitude is no wise abated as the day of the 15th. The afternoon papers contained a statement that General Patterson, Major General of the 1st Division of the Pennsylvania Volunteers, had that day resigned his position. The statement was made by telegram from Harrisburg. The newsboys shouted the fact as a means for increasing the sales, of course, and of the crowd hearing it started for the house of General Patterson to solicit that gentleman to show his colors. The crowd reached his house at 13th and Locust and marshaled around the house. They required the general to show his flag, and the glorious bunting was displayed forthwith from the second-story window. The crowd cheered the flag and took their leave. They later returned in the evening and surrounded the house for a second time, demanding to know the reason for General Patterson's resignation. It is well understood that General Patterson, who was charged with secessionism, didn't end up throwing up his commission, though. The Gazette noted that the mob was a little turbulent, but perfectly good-natured. General Patterson made an appearance and a little speech. He informed the crowd that he had not resigned and that if his auditors were anxious to fight, they might at once enroll their names, and he would personally lead them against the enemy. This satisfied, the multitude withdrew. Several prominent Southerners in the city with secessionist proclivities, including Robert Tyler, the son of former President John Tyler and a resident of the city and nearby Bristol, Pennsylvania, received a warning from a so-called vigilant committee. The next day, the Philadelphia Inquirer editorialized, "The fever raged yesterday in the city with increased tumult, the pervading excitement exceeding that of Saturday and Sunday. There can be no mistaking that the feeling that now agitates this country, insolent or insulting language or treatment and injuries which have been heaped upon the national government, violent passions seem to sway those ordinary citizens. The agitation is causing the mob to be stirred. Excited crowds congregated in the street to hear and debate the latest reports, and everyone who hinted sympathy with the secessionists were made to take a stand. One citizen's ill-advised comments attracted a substantial mob, forcing him to hide in a Chestnut Street drugstore until the police arrived. Later in the evening, an intoxicated man who did fate by declaring himself a Southern sympathizer, a rush was made when this secessionist apologized and stated that he was a Philadelphian and a Union man. Well then, the rejoinder, take off your hat and give 3 cheers for the United States, and he did so. While the crowd still gathered at Chestnut, though relatively quiet, other mobs about noon began to move in other directions, insisting that hotels, colleges, and still more newspapers display some pro-Union sentiments and require the flag. The Evening Argus was also a target. Also, Erasmus Poulsen, the new pension agent. The proprietor of the Washington House at 3rd and Chestnut made a homemade banner that read, "In hoc signo vinces," translated, the sign, thou shalt conquer. In this sign, thou shalt conquer the Constitution, Major Anderson, and the Union. Retribution to traitors. It attracted much attention. Many more businesses, homes, and public buildings were made to show the colors, this to the satisfaction of the crowd. And their sports by this time seemed to be interfering with, and by this time, many of the incidents were taken as young people's hijinks rather than dangerous political activity. Small, rather innocent incidents reported continued into midday. The crowd ripped the clothes from one supposed secessionist's back, put another man's head in a noose, and roughed up various victims. While the crowd at 9th and Chestnut, Mr. Dick, the janitor of the university building, had his pocket picked containing over $200. We're wrapping up soon. When the proprietors of the American Hotel on Chestnut Street above 5th accidentally, by some mismanagement, flew their flag upside down, the mistake was immediately discovered and the flag lowered, but not before the crowd had noticed the movement. And a rush for the hotel was the consequence. In a few minutes, the flag again appeared with the right side up, and the crowd testifies its satisfaction by cheering. One local paper contributed to the incendiary spirit by publishing names and addresses of several wealthy Southerners of the city. Armed with this information, the crowd marched through the streets demanding shows of patriotism at the homes they targeted. Robert Taylor, as mentioned, the former Democratic chairman, took refuge in the courthouse, and Customs Collector Joseph Baker, a Buchanan appointee, was forced to show the flag. Baker's mother's family supported the Democratic Party, and her brother was a prominent Democratic politician. Robert Tyler's father, John, the former president, supported the Union during the Civil War, and the family moved to Philadelphia in 1861 when the Confederate Army occupied East Tennessee. George Cadwalader quieted the crowd by offering to lead the rioters to the South to fight the Confederacy. Miss Wister of the city wrote, The mob went to Uncle George Cadwalader, who General Patterson's William B. Reed, and was finally dispersed authoritatively by Mayor Henry with a strong body of police. Worcester added that the most moderate, mannerly mob ever heard of, but in reality, they were the utmost of excitement and the least thing would have fired them. And then riots must have followed. On the 16th, in the afternoon, a mob of 100 or 200 boys also went to the residence of a Josiah Randall on Walnut Street below 8th and demanded that a flag should be displayed. The family told them that they did not possess a flag, and the crowd provided one, which was placed on the building. The Randalls were an active Whig family. Joseph's father, Samuel Jackson Randall, shifted to the Democratic Party after the war's demise. This satisfied the boys that then went away, intending it said, to visit the house of William Reed on Walnut Street. In the meantime, the mayor had been informed of these circumstances going on and hurried in pursuit of the mob with his reserved officers. In Walnut Street above 8th, the officers came upon the party, and the chief of police, Ruggles, took into custody the ringleader. Mayor Henry addressed the crowd, again telling them that quote, a mob of irresponsible minors should not be permitted to set the laws of defiance and terrify quiet citizens. The rights of all must be respected, and as chief magistrate of this city, he was determined to put a stop to the lawlessness. Mayor Henry declared that this had now gone on too far, and he would permit no further indulgence of this reckless spirit. He added that if it was necessary to take life to accomplish the preservation of the public grace, eventually that extremity would be resorted to. And if they paid this penalty of their folly and violence, the responsibility for it would rest with themselves. In conclusion, His Honor invoked all to separate quietly before he would be compelled to use force to compel them to do so. The speech was resolved without any demonstrations of disrespect, and the crowd slowly scattered. We trust that this will be the last of these turbulent demonstrations, which are becoming a nuisance, the mayor said. The Philadelphia Bulletin printed, much allowance is to be made for a people exasperated as we of the North have been by the revolutionists of the South. But the mode of which the temper of Philadelphia was displayed yesterday and last evening was unbecoming, to say the least of it. We only just escaped having a serious riot. A crowd of men and boys traveled through the city, visiting the offices, stores, and houses of such persons as was suspected of favoring Southern rebellion and obliging them to show the American flag or give some other token of their adhesion to the government. Flags were scarce, and in many cases it was impossible to obtain them, but the mob persisted and threatened until through the friendly offices of neighbors, the suspected persons were able to show their colors. Now it is very proper in the present crisis of this country, of our country, that every person should define his position. And it is very necessary that every man that is not true to his government should be known. But this must not be done through the efforts of a mob. The laws and the peace of the city must be maintained. And as good citizens who are anxious to preserve the honor of the American flag untarnished can do it in some better way than by rushing through the streets and threatening those who fancied, in many cases unjustly, to be disloyal. The mayor and the police were active and efficient yesterday and prevented any actual violence today. There is a northeasterly rainstorm which favors the preservation of order. But if there should be a renewal of tumultuous proceedings of yesterday, efficient measures should be adopted to stop them immediately. Mayor Henry on the same day issues this proclamation to the citizens of Philadelphia. Treason against the state of Pennsylvania or against the United States will not be suffered within this city, nor will violence to persons or property of its inhabitants be tolerated. I do hereby require all good citizens to disclose and make known to the lawful authorities every person rendering in this city aid to enemies in open war against the state and the United States by and listening and procuring for that purpose or furnishing such enemies with arms, ammunition, provisions, or other assistance. I do hereby require and command that all persons shall refrain from assembling in the highways of this city unlawfully, riotously, or tumultuously, warning them that the same will be at their peril. The laws of our state and the federal government must be obeyed. The peace and credit of Philadelphia shall be preserved. May God save our Union. Given under the seal of the city of Philadelphia, this 16th day of 1861. Mayor Henry, having established that the pursuit of order would lead to the arrest of active secessionists and a possible shooting of riotous anti-secessionists, and Henry's statement met with strong approval. The Public Ledger publishing that the object of the war is to establish the authorities of the law over the land. How can we establish this if we begin by a disregard of it at home? In the government halls, gaming and understanding of the events at Fort Sumter, the city's responsibilities, the Select Council introduced an ordinance appropriating $10,000 for the purchase of arms for use of a home guard. The expenditures of this money to be under the mayor's direction and control. A subscription list was also printed for the purchasing 12 howitzers for this guard. An ordinance was submitted also appropriating $100,000 for the relief of the families of those engaged in the service of their country. The Common Council passed an ordinance appropriating $125,000 for this purpose. The same body also passed an appropriation of $500,000 to enable the mayor to preserve the peace of the city and prevent unlawful combinations against the government. All these appropriations received unanimous support in both branches of councils, showing that but one patriotic sentiment animates all parties in that body. When he went into the town on April 18, Sidney George Fisher found the streets all aflutter with flags and confidently reported that we are not likely to suffer from the greater evil of partisan war amongst ourselves. The publishers of the Palmetto Flag repeated their announcement that they would not subject the city to more rioting in order to publish their views. Some Southern sympathizers left town immediately. The rest joined the Palmetto Flag in judicious silence and decorated their homes and office with flags. As Sidney George Fisher explained, it is at the risk of any man's life that he utters publicly a sentiment in favor of secession in the South. And so ends my presentation on the events of roughly from April 13 through April 16th in the city of Philadelphia in the year 1861. And many scenes, incidents such as these, I think, were seen all across the Union as the war fever spread quickly.
All right, thank you, Michael.
Sure thing, John Eric.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I'll start with maybe a few comments or questions. Mayor Henry seems like a really interesting guy and maybe a calming presence. I know that after John Brown's execution, Henry had to calm another mob and use a dummy coffin, I guess, as Brown's body was going to pass through Philadelphia. There was another mob, and he had to use a dummy coffin to draw the mob away and actually get Brown's body out of there. So he seems like an interesting guy.
Yes, he is a very interesting story as well. That's a story that I might, in my way, I might get to that story as well. I think that was in December of 1859, and there was, I understand, a pro-slavery demonstration in the city of Philadelphia at that time. But yeah, Mayor Henry was of course, a pro-union mayor, a member of the People's Party before actually the Republican Party was formed, and then a Republican, a friend of President Lincoln. I think he served 3 terms as president, mayor of the city, and was a calming influence. Like I said, the mayor's job predominantly was control of the police department, and he and Chief Officer Samuel Ruggles entertained a lot of these incidents throughout their time.
Okay. I guess my question would be, I know Philadelphia has ties to so many prominent generals during the war, from Meade, McClellan, Hancock, Birney, Patterson, who you mentioned. So many of these guys have had their papers digitized or their letters published. Have any more of them? Did they say anything about this or make reference to it?
Unfortunately, I can't answer. I can't really answer those. But I could add that a great many of citizens in Philadelphia, including military men, let's say doctors from the University of Pennsylvania, which lost about 1/3 of their doctors to the Confederacy. Many colleges and businesses and the leadership of Philadelphia went south following the surrender of Fort Sumter. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to come across any papers or kind of quotes or anything from the Civil War generals.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? I'll open the floor. We've had a good audience on Facebook as well, but I don't see any questions there. Anyone has anything, you're welcome to ask now. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any here.
Okay.
So we will wrap this up. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll go ahead and ask this. There was more I was curious about, but mainly what became of all the rioters later on in the war? Was there any ramification, long-term thing with any of the people involved?
Well, again, unfortunately, I haven't been able to ascertain that, and I'm happy to follow up with further research on that. I know I would say that many of the people in the riots and those that have supported the Confederacy came back to the city and became good citizens of the city. But Philadelphia remained a pro, mostly northern southern supporting city, and so I don't know that they were supported so greatly in coming back. It took a long time for that to take place. But unfortunately, I've been scouring the newspapers to learn of the people arrested on that day and the ringleader in particular. Unfortunately, with no luck yet, but I'm still on the scouring to see if anyone was brought before a judge or as they would bring them before aldermen in the city. But,
Thank you.
Sure.
I was telling Michael earlier this week, a little closer to home for those of us in Pittsburgh. The city where I live in Wheeling, West Virginia, which is just about 45 minutes south of Pittsburgh. We also had a pro-Southern, pro-Confederate newspaper here in Wheeling, and funny enough, it was called the Daily Union. So while there wasn't a mob to suppress that paper, they did run the editor of that paper out of town. It was very short-lived, and it stopped publishing, I believe, in late May of 1861. And they ran the editor, Philip Moore, out of town, and he ended up joining a Confederate cavalry company. So we had similar things here closer to home. And I'm not sure if Pittsburgh had an openly, newspapers were hyper partisan in that time. We think of partisan politics today, but they were hyper partisan at that time. And so you had Democratic newspapers who might not be in favor of Lincoln or Lincoln's administration, but they might not have been openly pro-Southern as well. Interesting to hear about this newspaper and this mob, but definitely these kinds of things are happening all around the country at this time, in the early stages of the war in April and May 1861.
Yeah, I have one thing to add, that of the articles and printings of the Palmetto Flag, under their banner and on their first page, they printed among other things, that a small paragraph printed a new and brilliant paper, they called themselves, with the above title, which has been adopted after mature reflection, and it will be laid before the public with no intention to adopt sectional views or extreme partisan opinions, but simply to afford to our Southern friends and their Northern sympathizers a liberal vehicle for the expression of their views and opinions. They really saw themselves as the bastion of freedom, and a link to the founding fathers in the Revolutionary War. And they were the newspaper really promoted the Southern way of life, the keeping of and expanding of slavery, and so forth. So I would end my comments by saying that although they called it an advertising sheet or an advertising dodge, the articles and the opinions and the way it was written say differently. It was written on a very high level, that I don't think was reaching the masses of people who were either not reading newspapers at all, or were reading simpler, easier to understand papers. But the Palmetto Flag was written in such a stern and strong and language that it was very much aimed, I believe, at the leadership and the leadership of the city, and the very well-educated and connected Southern sympathizers, and not just the average citizen. Now, a dodge would be kind of a ruse. It's kind of they're calling it an advertising dodge to say that. I think it's I try to explain that it kind of gives the paper the idea that it was that it was a simple advertising sheet, and that it was as it's put a dodge, kind of a fun and not kind of a serious newspaper that could cause public opinion to change and to really generate interest in the Southern cause. So the dodge was really a matter of that it was an advertising sheet for the dollar jewelry stores, and this was not the case at all. They may have sold jewelry for pennies and nickels, but this Palmetto Flag newspaper was not for for the uneducated and civil-minded citizens of Philadelphia. And so that way, I think it was a dodge or sold under false pretenses that this newspaper was kind of not very serious, and it was much more serious than the other newspapers of the city. Very
I mentioned
could be dangerous in the hands of pro-Confederate, pro-Southern sympathizers.
I'd mentioned, the papers were hyper-partisan at that time, but they were also very big on hyperbole. And I think calling it an advertising sheet was a nice way of putting it down, saying there's no news there, it's just advertisements.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, nothing to see here.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking as looking at the other newspapers in the city, and I'm sure in the papers in the Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania areas and West Virginia and so forth, is that all these newspapers were, you could call advertising dodges. In the midst of a Civil War beginning through the end, 1864 and 65, advertising did not cease. Meeting notices and kind of incidental meetings and things did not cease, and certainly advertising did not cease. In fact, President Lincoln had his own arm. It was one of the national newspapers in Washington. I can't remember the name exactly. The Intelligencer or one of those was selected by the administration to be their so-called mouthpiece. And so, if there wasn't support and advertising in these newspapers, I guess as it is through the history of the country, they would not exist.
Yeah, we think today about, the stories are ranked on importance by where they show up in paper. Is it a front page above the fold or below, or is it buried somewhere inside? But typically, a section of the front page would be reserved for advertising, and almost the entire back page. You would get the front page where we would expect to see the biggest stories today. At that time were more, there would be poetry and serial stories that they would publish, and maybe in page 2 on the inside you might get your national news, and then page 3 you might get the important local news. So it's not front page above the fold in 1861. It's more buried on the inside paper, and plenty of advertising.
That's it, John Eric. It's a great point. In the main newspaper that I leaned on for this, as you well heard, maybe more, was the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Philadelphia Inquirer covered this incident. Of its 8 pages, it was on page 8, and so that's very true that the some of these newspapers had advertisements, like you said, on the first page. They would have church announcements and goings on, advertising. Like for the Colgate Soap Company, and in the Philadelphia newspapers. All through the wartime, simple ads, like from Whitman chocolates and so forth, would be more prominently displayed than the political news.
All right, Father Bob, I see you have your hand up there. Were you going to ask another question, or?
Yeah, my background, other than being a priest, is I'm an analytical chemist, and I'm sitting here thinking that it's interesting that one publisher published pro-union, fairly neutral, and pro-Southern newspapers under the banner, I guess, of being advertising. So they were kind of capitalists at best. and plugged their product to all three groups, but by the same token kept their political leanings separate, so that the pro-Northern wouldn't get the pro-Southern view, and the pro-Southern wouldn't get, kind of like, I guess like cable news now. You can pick the flavor you want and still get an advertisement for I don't know, Hyundai or Ford or Chevy or something like that.
Absolutely correct. I know from researching newspapers in the Philadelphia area, President Lincoln's, the political, his political conventions and speeches and trips and so forth might be covered in the Philadelphia Bulletin or the Philadelphia Inquirer. But if you cross the Delaware River and head to New Jersey or and Camden newspapers and Trenton newspapers especially, you would find a much different story, where one of my main topic of interest and research has been the Great Central Sanitary Fair held in Philadelphia in June of 1864, raising over $1 million for the soldiers in the field. That was sponsored by for the Sanitary Commission, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware combined to hold the event. And an example of this type of newspaper coverage is that the newspapers in Trenton, at the time of Lincoln's visit to the city in June of 1864, on the 16th, it's a topic that I've been chasing for about 18 to 20 years. But at the time, it was like post convention in post Baltimore convention. But the point being, Lincoln's visit to Philadelphia only a week or so after the Baltimore Convention was covered extensively in the Philadelphia newspapers and the pro-Northern newspapers in the city, but otherwise the newspapers in New Jersey, more or less, or your Democratic leaning newspapers like the Philadelphia Age that was printed in the city would have literally 10 words on President Lincoln's visit to the city, and would have literally columns and columns of coverage of George McClellan's visit to West Point the very same week, like a day or two apart, as the political campaigns were unfolding, and President Lincoln's visit to the city, more or less a campaign visit, although he did say that he was here to swell the earnings of the Great Central Sanitary Fair, which I believe him that he said that. But McClellan's trip to dedicate the Soldiers' Monument at West Point in the Democratic leaning and Jersey papers, more or less, was much more prominent. As I always, whenever I speak in New Jersey, I always, always give them a little jab for not voting for Lincoln, twice. So, but I don't shy away. As soon as you cross the river, it's kind of a different scene there, a little bit. I've spoken in Delaware too, and so you get different attitudes and different opinions in different areas. And I understand the questions too. I enjoy the questions, of course, and the banter. Sometimes the further away I get from Philadelphia, the Philadelphia stories, could have less resonance, as people are not familiar with the streets and the local politicians and things like that. But every city has stories like this.
All right, Michael and Alexandria, I see you had your hand up, and then you can go ahead, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, just one comment about it. It's basically some of what you said earlier. The newspapers in the first half of the 18th century were still pretty much all declaring what political party they were affiliated with or what group they were supporting. And it was common knowledge to the people out there who they knew which paper was covering who and who was supporting what. And that goes back much farther with a lot of things like Aaron Burr and other stories of those days. I just wanted to mention it at some point because that's significantly different from now. All publications try not to declare what they are, even if you can see their leanings. They all say, well, we're completely neutral. No, no, it's just, that's just changed more and more in the last half century. But going way back, that was the case. That's all.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really the crux of the story that I've told, and a lot of the post Fort Sumter reaction in the country is that the North, a lot of the papers had different influences over their constituents. And what also comes to mind, I'd have to say that I think a lot of these newspapers were kind of written towards maybe certain small groups or even individuals, that a lot of things were placed in the newspapers by the editors and supporters aimed at a few influential leaders of the city, if not speaking directly to certain individuals. And so, it's again, as Eric, as a archivist, can attest to, that it's really difficult to understand how these newspapers are written. They have thousands of words and very wordy, same reference. But I mean, who read these newspapers? Did these common people of the day have time to sit down and read these newspapers? It's hard to imagine.
Need to look at numbers. I believe the common people across the country were mostly very literate at the time. Basically, you'd have to, only as an example, you go to Ken Burns's show where he had all the letters from all the people. They were very eloquent, and they were written by mostly common people. Yeah. People were much more literate back then, and well, like now, not even teaching cursive. Everyone knew a lot more as far as being literate at that time, in my view. And I think you can get that from some of what you see. It is surprising because I'll look at papers from the 1880s and they're fairly complex. In my hometown of Lynchburg, Virginia, it's pretty, the wording, and I suppose that I'm looking more at AP writers and stuff like that from the time, but they're fairly complex.
Yes. Yeah, anyway, that's why I mentioned that. Yes.
Yeah, and especially in smaller cities and towns, your newspaper might be your only source of news. We get inundated with news today on television and social media and our phones and everything. But the newspapers of that time were very plugged into the telegraph, and so as they were getting the news, they were pumping out these papers. And so, I think it was a big deal for people, and it did have. There was material in the paper that would interest, a husband and a wife or children as well. I think they tried to cater to a family. So, yeah, and it's amazing that some of these. I know you mentioned that the Palmetto Flag, that these surviving copies are in rough condition, and that's so often the case. Newspapers were ephemeral. They weren't meant to be kept forever. And they weren't designed, and especially when you get into the Civil War and you get into wood pulp and lignin and the acidity in this paper that's, over time causing them to turn brown and become brittle and chip and fall apart. They were never meant to last 160 years. So we're lucky to have what we do, and And that's why it's so good to see the Library of Congress. And I know Pennsylvania, I think Penn State has done a lot in digitizing Pennsylvania's Civil War newspapers. It's so important to have these digitized, not only for access, but because these papers weren't meant to last forever.
Yeah.
All right, we'll wrap this up. Thank you again for everyone. We've had a good crowd on Facebook, and then on here, we had a good, really static crowd. We typically have a lot of people coming and going, but everyone stuck around. Great presentation, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing everyone next month. If in Carnegie, in person at the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall, if you are able, on June 12th at 1 p.m. Otherwise, we will be back here on Zoom and on Facebook Live with Zach Cowsert talking about the West Virginia State Guard and the Civil War. And I'll have that information up on the website within the next couple of days. So thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate you coming today, and I look forward to seeing everyone next month.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Stay